Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slower, quieter time. Let the weight of the day melt away as you settle into stillness. Dim your lights, pull the covers up gently around your shoulders, and let your body rest easy. Maybe you hear the soft hum of a fan, the distant whisper of wind brushing past the trees outside your window, or the faint crackle of imagined embers in a long-forgotten hearth. You're here now. If this calm journey helps you unwind, maybe tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. No pressure, just ease. Tonight, we'll meander through the cozy ruins of forgotten dreams, the peaceful remains of 19th century utopias that once reached for perfection and didn't quite get there. Some were sweet, others strange, but all of them now gently asleep in the arms of history. So take a deep breath, and let me tell you about a place called Chapter 2. Fruitlands. Let me tell you about a little experiment tucked into the hills of Massachusetts, where cows were frowned upon, root vegetables were shunned, and the idea of purity extended all the way to underwear. It was the summer of 1843, and a small band of thinkers, led by the earnest and often shirtless Bronson Alcott, gathered to found a place they called Fruitlands. They envisioned a paradise free from the moral corruption of modern life. Imagine a vegan Whole Foods manager running a commune with Socratic flair, and you've got the right vibe. I picture the morning dew clinging to the wild grasses of Harvard, Massachusetts. A rooster crowing in defiance of the group's anti-animal agenda. The mist slowly rolling off the hills as the small cluster of idealists rose from their beds, probably cold and certainly mattressless, to greet the new day with a bowl of wheat porridge and a healthy distrust of commerce. Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott, yes, of Little Women fame, believed deeply in self-reliance, purity, and the power of a good bowel movement. He and his comrade Charles Lane outlawed meat, dairy, coffee, tea, alcohol, warm baths, and even cotton, since it was picked by enslaved people. Instead, they wore linen, often homemade, and leaned heavily into hand-woven vibes. It was a kind of rustic chic with a stern face and cold toes. Fruitlands was meant to be an agrarian Eden, but there were complications. For one, no one in the commune actually knew how to farm. The land was rocky, the weather less than forgiving, and the dietary restrictions made nutrition a complex jigsaw puzzle of carrots, air, and philosophical clarity. Imagine trying to dig a garden without root vegetables. Potatoes and carrots were considered below foods, growing in darkness and therefore tainted. Turnips? Suspicious. Garlic? Positively wicked. The group preferred fruits that reached toward the sun, like apples, or grains that swayed nobly in the wind. But fruit trees don't exactly spring up overnight. By autumn, their bellies were empty, their clothes thinner than a lace curtain in January, and their ideals were frostbitten. Louisa May Alcott, just 10 years old at the time, later recalled in her journals the joy of fresh apples and the despair of yet another boiled wheat meal. Her mother, Abigail, quietly despised the entire experiment. She cooked in secret, preserved fruit, and even hoarded a bit of molasses, like a rebel Martha Stewart of the transcendentalist world. There were only a dozen or so residents at Fruitlands, and tensions simmered quickly. When winter crept in, along with hunger and frost, the cracks in the utopia became canyons. Charles Lane, frustrated with the community's lack of spiritual rigor, left abruptly, taking his son with him. Bronson spiraled into a deep depression, and Abigail threatened to take the children and go. It was over by January. 7 months. That's all Fruitlands lasted. But doesn't that image linger? A snow-covered orchard, the wind creaking through the bare branches, and a handful of people wrapped in linen, staring down a blizzard with nothing but ideals and cracked wheat. Even now, when I imagine a quiet snowfall, I think of Fruitlands. And tell me, have you ever tried to do something perfectly? To strip away every flaw, every comfort, until only truth remains? That was Fruitlands. Idealism with chattering teeth. And as we leave that wind-blown farmhouse, let your thoughts drift to a sunnier place, one a little warmer, a little stranger, and just as filled with dreams. There's a sleepy bend in the Wabash River, in what is now southwestern Indiana, where the grass grows thick and the evenings settle like honey. That's where, in 1825, a man named Robert Owen dreamed of building heaven on earth. New Harmony, they called it. I imagine the sky there in late spring, a lazy swirl of pinks and oranges, the air heavy with the smell of wildflowers and chimney smoke. The birdsong soft, like the world whispering a lullaby just for you. And amid this pastoral quiet, a curious idea was blooming. Equal parts science, socialism, and stubborn hope. Robert Owen was a Welsh industrialist with a heart full of reform and a head full of optimism. He had grown wealthy running textile mills in Scotland, where he implemented radical improvements, like shorter working hours and schooling for children. That was rare in those days. Humane, even. But he wasn't satisfied. No, Owen wanted more than better factories. He wanted utopia. So he bought a town. Literally. He purchased an entire settlement, buildings, mills, homes, and farmland, from a group of German separatists known as the Harmonists. The Harmonists, led by a man named George Rapp, had lived in celibate communal bliss for over a decade. But their messiah hadn't shown up yet, and Indiana winters weren't gentle. So they sold their land and moved on. Into this ready-made village stepped Robert Owen, declaring it would become a beacon of rational cooperation. A place where private property was abolished, schools were free, and everyone labored not for money, but for the common good. I like to imagine the first morning of Owen's vision. Dew clinging to the clapboard houses, the clang of a communal bell, the smell of fresh cornbread wafting from a large shared kitchen. Somewhere, children in linen tunics giggling as they chased a hoop down a dusty lane. No money, no bosses, no servants, just equality, or at least the idea of it. You see, Robert Owen was a bit like someone who throws the perfect dinner party, but forgets to invite a chef. He brought scientists, intellectuals, artists, and reformers to New Harmony, but very few farmers or carpenters or folks who knew how to, well, build a fence. Everyone was a visionary, but no one knew how to milk the cow. There were lectures on geology, astronomy, and education. Owen invited naturalists and poets, all dreaming in harmony. But without practical workers, the town struggled to keep its crops alive. Buildings fell into disrepair. Disputes flared over chores and leadership. Everyone wanted equality, but someone still had to sweep the floor. And there was no formal government, just a spirit of consensus, which, as you might imagine, made every decision about as smooth as molasses uphill. There was a man named William McClure, a geologist and philanthropist, who tried to help organize the chaos. He even funded a school that was years ahead of its time, full of maps and models and learning by doing. Children dug for fossils and learned through experience, rather than rote memorization. But the cracks were deep. By 1827, barely 2 years in, the dream was fading. Many residents drifted away. Some returned to city life. Others wandered on to other communes. Owen, disappointed but undeterred, moved on to continue his advocacy work elsewhere. And New Harmony, like so many utopias, became more of a memory than a movement. Still, the buildings remained. Many of them still do. You can walk those quiet streets today, run your hand along the old brick walls, and hear the echo of that hope, the gentle murmur of an idea too big for its shoes. I often wonder what it must have felt like on a summer evening in 1826. The sky wide and purple, stars beginning to show. A candle flickering in a window. The warm smell of beans cooking slowly over a fire. A young teacher reciting poetry to a group of children on the green. For a moment, maybe it worked. Maybe the dream held. Maybe, if you were lucky enough to be there at twilight, with the crickets singing and the wind just cool enough to lift your collar, it felt like a better world was possible. And isn't that what dreams are for? Not to last forever, but to show us what could be. Now, as that moon rises over the quiet banks of the Wabash, let your mind wander again. To another place, another dream, another softly fading utopia, where things were just a little stranger still. The Mississippi River winds slow and wide through Illinois, its surface like glass on a windless day. There, along a grassy bend, once rose a shimmering city of dreams, with whitewashed buildings, a rising temple, and an ambition to outshine Babylon itself. This was Nauvoo. The year was 1839. The name meant beautiful place in Hebrew, and it was intended as a sacred refuge, part heavenly city, part theocratic republic, and all stitched together by the forceful charm of one man, Joseph Smith. He was the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. the Mormons, as many knew them, and Nauvoo was to be their promised land. A city on a hill, a utopia by river's edge. I imagine the soft flicker of oil lamps along the muddy lanes, the clinking of hammers as houses rose swiftly on the frontier. There was music, too, fiddles and hymns drifting over the wheat fields, laughter spilling from log cabins and meeting halls. Nauvoo blossomed quickly. Within 5 years, it was one of the largest cities in Illinois. Nearly 12,000 souls called it home. And it wasn't just big, it was well planned. Grid streets, public buildings, workshops, a bustling press, and a temple, gleaming white stone rising skyward. But here's the thing about utopias built on charisma. They rise fast, and sometimes crumble just as quickly. Joseph Smith ruled Nauvoo with equal parts vision and iron. He was mayor, prophet, lieutenant general of the local militia, and judge. A spiritual guide and civic leader all in one. Like if Plato, George Washington, and your high school principal were fused into a single lantern-lit figure in long coats. At first, the city welcomed all. Converts from as far as England streamed in. They believed in communal effort, in building a godly society free from the sins of the world. Some practiced plural marriage. Others built shops and blacksmiths. There was order, and there was faith. But there was also secrecy and resentment. Neighbors grew suspicious. The Nauvoo Charter gave the city extraordinary legal autonomy. The church's militia, called the Nauvoo Legion, numbered nearly 5,000 strong. Outsiders whispered of conspiracies, of underground ceremonies, of a prophet who had grown too powerful. And indeed, Joseph Smith's ambitions were growing. He began to teach about celestial kingdoms, about divine authority, about ruling not just a church, but a people. At one point, he even ran for president of the United States. And then, the newspaper incident. A group of disaffected Mormons, troubled by Smith's teachings and rumors of secret polygamy, started a rival paper, the Nauvoo Expositor. They published a single issue, accusing Smith of authoritarian control and moral corruption. Smith, as mayor, declared the press a public nuisance and ordered the printing press destroyed. That did it. The destruction of the Expositor ignited a firestorm. Critics called it tyranny. Militias formed. The Illinois governor intervened. Joseph Smith was arrested and taken to Carthage jail. And then, in a moment that shattered the utopia, he was killed. A mob stormed the jailhouse on June 27, 1844. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were shot and killed. Martyrs to their followers. Traitors to their enemies. The dream of Nauvoo unraveled. Within 2 years, most of its residents fled. Persecuted and bitter, they left behind the White Temple and the sturdy houses and moved west, eventually founding Salt Lake City under Brigham Young. And the city of Nauvoo, once called Zion, once full of promise, fell into ruin. The temple was destroyed. The streets grew quiet. And for a while, all that remained were the bones of a dream. Yet, the air there still hums. Walk its streets today, and you might hear it. The faint clatter of wagon wheels. The call of a preacher at dusk. A child's laughter echoing down a narrow alley. A city that once believed it could be eternal. And though the dream failed, like all the others, it still left something behind. An echo. A warning. A whisper in the quiet night that says, try again. So now, let the hush of the river rock you back, like a raft drifting under stars. And let us float forward, onward, to yet another failed utopia. One founded not by prophets or philosophers, but by pirates. Yes, really. Now, I know what you're thinking. This isn't the Caribbean. There are no parrots or buried treasure. But don't worry. This sleepy little tale has its own kind of mischief. It starts up north, on the blurry border between New Hampshire and what was, back then, Lower Canada, around the 1830s. There, tucked among the misty forests and slow rivers, was a patch of land caught in a bureaucratic shrug. Neither the United States nor Great Britain could quite decide who owned it. So, the people living there did the only sensible thing. They declared independence. That's right. A few hundred settlers, trappers, loggers, and farmers decided that if no one else could figure it out, they might as well be their own country. And thus, in 1832, the Republic of Indian Stream was born. I like to imagine the first National Assembly, a collection of rugged folks in wool coats and muddy boots, gathered in a tavern lit by smoky lanterns. arguing over bylaws while sipping something suspicious from wooden mugs. They weren't anarchists. No, they had laws, a constitution, even a militia, if you could call a dozen men with hunting rifles a militia. Their currency? Well, mostly barter. Potatoes, firewood, and homemade maple syrup counted for a lot. And their foreign policy? Mostly, please don't shoot at us. They even created official documents. The seal of Indian Stream was probably drawn on the back of a receipt or a cowhide, for all we know. But it mattered. It meant something. In a world of empires and borders, they claimed a tiny space where common sense and mutual respect ruled the day. But utopias, even small ones, attract problems. A man named John Tyler, not the US president, but a similar flavor, was sent to enforce British laws in the disputed territory. Meanwhile, New Hampshire insisted it was their land. Tensions rose. Arrests were made. There were even a few armed standoffs, though calling them battles would be generous. More like stubborn glares across a muddy road. And then came the Salt War. Ah yes, salt. The most humble of commodities, and in this case, the match that lit the powder keg. One day, an Indian Stream citizen tried to smuggle a barrel of salt across the border, dodging customs duties. British authorities intervened. American sympathizers objected. A local man was shot in the foot. And suddenly, a dispute over condiments turned into a political crisis. Eventually, the U.S. sent in troops. The Republic folded quietly in 1835, just 3 years after it began. No revolution. No last stand. Just a sigh, and the sound of a makeshift flag being lowered into a crate of potatoes. But oh, what a dream. Can't you just picture it? A quiet pine-scented morning, the sun rising over the frost-dusted hills, smoke curling from chimneys. Children sledding down the snowy banks. Chickens clucking, utterly indifferent to geopolitical confusion. And somewhere, an old man with a musket slung over his shoulder, whittling a stick, saying, "We were our own country once." And maybe, for a moment, they were. They lived by their own rules, took care of their neighbors, argued in a language of laughter, barter, and stubborn hope. No kings, no presidents, just the rhythm of life on a disputed patch of land, where community meant more than politics. And now, that land is just part of New Hampshire, a gentle bend in the road, a place where the trees grow thick and the wind still whispers to itself, like it's telling a story no one else remembers. But we remember now, don't we? The Republic of Indian Stream. Small, strange, and entirely too human to last. Let that thought lull you deeper. Let your mind follow the flow of that gentle stream, down through the pine woods, past the chimneys and maple trees, until it reaches the next hidden harbor of 19th century dreaming. Because up next, we visit a town where no one was allowed to be better than anyone else, where ambition itself was politely discouraged. Have you ever visited a town that seems just a little too polite? Where no one raises their voice, ambition wears wool socks, and you get the distinct feeling that excellence is frowned upon. Unless everyone gets to be excellent, too, then you may have wandered into Yellow Springs, Ohio. Or at least, what it was briefly, in the 1820s, when it became one of Robert Owen's lesser-known utopian experiments. Yes, that Robert Owen again. The same industrialist turned social reformer who brought us the dream and gentle collapse of New Harmony. Apparently, one failed utopia wasn't enough for him. He needed a few more tries, and Yellow Springs was one such attempt. Tucked amid rolling hills and mineral springs that supposedly had curative powers, Yellow Springs attracted Owenite sympathizers, the kinds of folks who wore suspenders unironically, read poetry aloud under trees, and believed deeply that selfishness was a disease caused by capitalism and poor parenting. The plan? A perfectly cooperative society. Communal ownership. No private property. Equal work, equal reward. Oh, and no personal boasting. Everyone was to be modest, helpful, and committed to the collective good. Imagine the town square on a warm spring day. The air is rich with the scent of lilac and the faint sulfur tang of the springs. A group of men, sleeves rolled up, are building a barn. Together, slowly, deliberately. No one gives orders. No one claims credit. They simply work, side by side, like a well-behaved ant colony. Nearby, a woman is teaching a child arithmetic with pebbles. Not because it will help the child get ahead, but because it might help him contribute more evenly to the village pie chart of productivity. Everyone has shoes, but no one has nice shoes. That would be too individual. The colony operated under the Onite philosophy that people are shaped by their environments. Provide the right surroundings, free of competition, private property, and inequality, and you get better people. It was, in essence, a human terrarium, a little sealed dome of curated kindness. But you know how terrariums sometimes get moldy? Well, despite the beauty of the land and the warmth of some of the ideals, the colony began to fray at the edges. Arguments arose over labor, how much each person contributed versus how much they received. Quiet rivalries brewed. One man, it said, brought his own plow and was quietly resented for being too prepared. Some folks wanted to start a small publishing venture. Others saw it as elitist. One woman embroidered particularly beautiful table linens, and someone muttered that she was putting on airs. They meant well, truly, but human nature doesn't always flatten itself into a single, even layer. By 1827, the Yellow Springs experiment dissolved politely. No pitchforks, no riots, just an awkward meeting or two, some muffled disappointment, and then everyone sort of packed up their egalitarian dreams and went back to living slightly less perfect lives. But the springs remained. And even today, if you visit Yellow Springs, you can still smell that mineral scent in the air, especially after rain. You can walk the wooded trails, feel the thick green canopy overhead, and maybe, just maybe, you'll spot a ghost of the Onite colony. Not a literal ghost, more like an echo, a memory of a time when people tried to erase status and hierarchy, like erasing pencil lines from a page. No heroes, no stars, just neighbors, sharing cabbages and disappointment in equal measure. And doesn't that have a kind of strange charm? Sometimes we dream not of flying or ruling or glowing with brilliance. Sometimes we just dream of being enough, of being held in the middle of things, not too high, not too low, perfectly ordinary, in the best possible way. Let that thought soothe you now. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the quiet steps of those early settlers. Heel toe, everyone walking the same pace. And now, let's leave that modest little village behind and wander toward the next chapter. It's a little more fiery. And this one, it doesn't end with a polite handshake. Chapter 1. The North American phalanx. It started, like many 19th century dreams, with a pamphlet. A whisper of a better way to live, pressed between thin pages and handed from hand to hopeful hand. The year was 1843, and the idea came from across the Atlantic. A French philosopher named Charles Fourier had spun a vision of communal harmony. He called it the phalansteer. It was part farm, part palace, part spiritual greenhouse. A place where humans could flourish in cooperative unity, organized into perfectly balanced groups. And in the green hills of New Jersey, yes, New Jersey, a band of American idealists decided to make it real. They called it the North American Phalanx. Doesn't that name sound almost like a marching band made entirely of librarians? But this was no military unit. This was a farm commune where people shared everything, labor, meals, even laundry, and lived together in one large building, called the phalanstery. That word alone sounds like something dreamed up in a cozy fever, doesn't it? Phalanstery. You can almost hear the echo of boots on wooden floors, the creak of bunk beds, the hum of morning prayers as sunlight filtered through simple curtains. The phalanx wasn't a cult. It was something softer, gentler, just people trying to live a little better. They believed that cooperation would make work joyful, that no one should be too rich or too poor, that labor should rotate, no one stuck in the same job forever. One day you milked cows, the next you painted window frames. And if you happened to make really excellent butter, well, congratulations. You just became the official churn whisperer. Meals were taken in a shared dining hall. Long wooden tables, simple bread, apples in a big wooden bowl. Nothing fancy, but enough. Laughter, scraped chairs, the soft clatter of spoons. They tried to eat in silence, sometimes, to encourage thoughtfulness. But someone always cracked a joke. It wasn't perfect. Of course not. They argued about chores, about profits, about how strictly to follow Fourier's sometimes eccentric rules. Fourier once wrote that the sea would someday turn to lemonade. Yes, really. Still, for 12 whole years, the North American phalanx survived. That's practically ancient in Utopia years. They farmed. They built a sawmill. They held dances and readings. Children played beneath the apple trees while their parents debated labor theory. One child later recalled falling asleep to the sound of looms and night frogs. Doesn't that sound oddly comforting? But then came the fire. In 1854, the mill burned down. It had been the colony's main source of income, and without it, they couldn't afford to keep going. Members began to drift away, some toward cities, others toward more traditional farms. The phalanstery stood quiet. Rooms once filled with the smell of warm rye bread and sun-dried laundry slowly gathered dust. Floors creaked to no footsteps. Windows stared out blankly into overgrown fields. The land was eventually sold. The experiment, forgotten. And yet, something lingers. Sometimes I imagine waking up there, in a small wooden bunk, sunlight cutting across the floorboards, the muffled sound of laughter downstairs. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed and pad barefoot down the long hallway toward breakfast. Maybe you're on dish duty today. Maybe you'll harvest squash. It doesn't really matter, because no one's above you. No one's below you. You're just part of the phalanx. Maybe that's the closest thing to peace we ever get. And now, as the sun sets over those long-lost fields, let's wander onward to another dream, a bolder one, with uniforms, drills, and a slightly odd obsession with symmetry. Have you ever stepped into a house so clean it made you nervous to breathe? That was the general vibe at the village of Economy, Pennsylvania. The year was 1824, and a group of devout German immigrants, the Rappites, as they came to be known, had just relocated from Indiana to this new land, determined to build their own version of heaven. They called their movement the Harmony Society. Founded by Johann George Rapp, a charismatic preacher with a piercing stare and a suspiciously good sense of town planning, the Rappites believed that the second coming was near, and that they must prepare with diligence, discipline, and, for reasons only truly known to them, celibacy. Yes, the entire community was celibate, voluntarily, men on one side, women on the other. No cozy fireside romances here. No sly glances over the butter churn. Just spiritual focus, daily labor, and buttoned-up tunics that probably made even hugging feel like a policy violation. But they were happy, or at least methodical about it. The village of Economy, named not for money, but for divine order, was laid out in neat rows. Every house painted white, every lawn tidy, every soul supposedly one step closer to paradise. And what did they do all day? They worked, but not in a grim or punishing way. They crafted. The Rappites were known for their fine textiles, handmade furniture, and beautifully kept gardens. Their beeswax candles were the kind that burned perfectly straight. Their glassware? Elegant. Their grapes? Award-winning. It was like Etsy, if Etsy were run by a Lutheran monastery with a side of German efficiency. Everyone shared in the profits. The society owned everything: homes, tools, land, and distributed resources equally. No one went hungry. No one flaunted wealth. And every night, the town glowed with lantern light and smelled faintly of fresh bread and lavender. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. For decades, at its height, Economy was one of the wealthiest communities per capita in the country. They had a silk mill, a printing press, orchards, a museum, and even a natural history collection with stuffed birds and fossils. Because why not? And yet, the clock was ticking. You can't build a multi-generational society if no one's having kids. The Rappites relied on new converts to replenish their numbers, but over time, recruitment slowed. Younger members left to marry. Others questioned the strict rules. By the mid-1800s, the community had dwindled to a few dozen aging members. One former member famously sued the society for his inheritance, and won. The tension between divine harmony and human yearning became too much. Johann Rapp died in 1847. Without his leadership, the society lost its guiding force. The last members lived on quietly, like leaves clinging to a branch in late autumn. The last Rappite died in 1906, but the village remains. Even now, you can visit Economy, walk its cobbled paths, tour the preserved homes, smell the faint, sweet ghost of beeswax and bread. Sometimes I imagine sitting on a wooden bench outside the church at dusk. Everything still, a soft wind rustling the tall grasses. Somewhere, a harmonium plays a slow hymn. Not sad, exactly, just resolved. The kind of place where nothing ever shouted. only whispered. They called it economy. But maybe it was really about peace. And now, we turn the page once more, toward a community where perfection meant performance, where even the furniture had a sense of drama, and where everyone knew how to act. Because up next, we visit a utopia of dancers, singers, and very enthusiastic communists. Let me tell you about a group of people who believed, really believed, that art could save the world. Not just poetry and painting, but structure, theater, music, education. The full orchestral score of a better society, played in perfect communal harmony. They were called the Icarians, and their story begins in France with a man named Etienne Cabot. Cabot was a dreamer in a waistcoat, a lawyer turned writer turned revolutionary. In 1840, he published a novel called Voyage in Icarie, about a fictional utopia called Icaria. In this ideal land, all property was communal, there was no poverty, education was free, and everyone lived together in perfect cooperation. You know, simple stuff. And then, because fiction wasn't enough, he decided to make it real. Cabot gathered followers, mostly skilled French workers and artisans, and set off across the Atlantic. After a few false starts, including a disastrous attempt in Texas where the only thing that thrived was mosquito bites, they landed in Nauvoo, Illinois. Yes, that Nauvoo. The same place we visited in Chapter 3 of Part 1. After the Mormons left, the Icarians moved in. They brought with them printing presses, pianos, tailoring kits, and dreams too big to fold. The Nauvoo Icaria was to be a republic of equals. They held votes. They wore simple uniforms. They abolished wages. Labor was shared, profits divided. Theaters were built. Schools were formed. Music echoed across the Mississippi. And everyone had a job, whether baking, sewing, acting, or teaching. Somehow, you could finish a day of communal farming and still have enough energy to perform in a 3-act comedy about class struggle. Just imagine it. A candlelit hall. The audience made up entirely of neighbors. A violin warming up in the corner. Wooden chairs scraping against the floor. A young girl in patched boots standing proudly on a homemade stage to recite a speech about liberty and bread. The Icarians loved education. They believed it was the key to equality. Children learned languages, sciences, literature. Adults had mandatory instruction sessions every week. And if you tried to skip, well, someone might show up with a book and a stern smile. For a while, it worked. There was a rhythm to it. A heartbeat. Everyone striving together, not just for survival, but for beauty. But utopias are delicate instruments. And sometimes, they go out of tune. Tensions grew. Some members wanted more centralized leadership. Others wanted full democracy. Some wanted stricter religious rules. Others leaned towards secularism. And Etienne Cabot, once their charismatic guide, began to seem more like a controlling director than an inspiring conductor. By the 1850s, the community fractured. One group stayed. Another splintered off, moving to Iowa, where they tried again. And again. And again. Each new Icaria lasted a little less than the one before. The final group, based in Corning, Iowa, limped into the 1890s before dissolving quietly into the surrounding countryside. No fireworks. No mutiny. Just the slow fade of a dream that couldn't quite hold its harmony. But what lingers? A few buildings. A few letters. Some beautiful linen dresses. And a story. A story about a group of people who believed that education and art and shared labor could build a new world. I imagine sitting in the back row of one of their community theaters. The wooden floor warm from the bodies that walked it all day. The air smelling faintly of wax and bread. Someone turns the crank on a music box. A violin hums a lullaby. And a voice begins a monologue about hope. Maybe it was never about achieving perfection. Maybe it was about rehearsing it. Again and again and again. Now, let's take a final bow in that quiet little hall. Let the lights dim. The applause fade. And our thoughts drift, not forward, but down. Because next, we descend underground, to a utopia carved into the earth. Yes, really, time to explore a forgotten village beneath your feet. If utopias usually build upward, towers, temples, domes of ambition, then this one did the opposite. It dug down. In the early 1800s, deep in the rolling hills of Kentucky, there lay a labyrinth of ancient stone. Vast, mysterious, winding for miles beneath the surface like the long-forgotten arteries of the earth. Mammoth Cave. Today, it's a national park, a place for spelunking and summer tours. But in the 1830s and 40s, it became something stranger, something quieter. A place where people tried to live. You see, some believed that the cave's cool, consistent climate, around 54 degrees Fahrenheit all year, was good for the body, even for the soul. Some believed it might cure tuberculosis. Others thought the silence itself could sharpen the mind. And so, for a brief and flickering moment, a small colony was formed. A utopia of stone and shadow. A place of health, labor, and candlelight. Can you picture it? You rise not with the sun, but with the damp hush of cave air brushing your skin. Your eyes adjust slowly. Shadows dance on the walls. A breakfast of corn mush and tea, eaten by the flicker of oil lamps. And your neighbors? A mix of patients, scientists, and seekers, all murmuring greetings in the dark. The settlement wasn't large. Maybe 20 or 30 people. They built crude wooden cabins inside the cave. Beds, chairs, even little stoves, set inside the carved belly of the earth. Some wrote journals. Some taught classes. One man taught philosophy by lamplight, seated on a limestone boulder. His voice echoed slightly, turning every sentence into a small sermon. Children, if there were any, learned to whisper. The days were spent in study, quiet labor, or slow, contemplative walks along the underground corridors. A few residents helped guide early tourists, who came to marvel at the vast caverns, their echoes, their stillness. And then came the music. Oh yes, on some nights, the cave would echo with violin or flute. Someone always had an instrument. The acoustics were haunting, notes bouncing off the stone in strange ways, hanging in the air like ghost lullabies. They had rules, of course. Respect the quiet. Share food and firewood. Do not venture too far without a guide. And no loud laughter after dark, which, ironically, could be any time, since there was no sun. But there was beauty here. Real, enveloping, unspoken beauty. Some said they slept better underground, that the walls held their dreams in place, like stone cradles. Others felt their thoughts stretch in new directions, freed from clocks and carriages and crowded parlors. They lived slowly, measuredly, like tree roots growing in reverse. But, as always, the silence grew too loud. Some residents grew ill. The dampness, it turned out, wasn't as healing as they'd hoped. Supplies were hard to haul in. Fires didn't burn cleanly, and the cave began to feel less like sanctuary and more like tomb. By the late 1840s, the underground community was gone. Gone quietly, of course. No collapse, no riot, just a slow ascent back to the surface. Some left journals behind, pages speckled with wax, still faintly smelling of ash. One entry reads, "It is peace like no other. But I miss the birds." Even now, if you tour Mammoth Cave, the guides will sometimes pause by a hollow space near a rock formation and say, "People once lived here." And you'll hear it differently, won't you? You'll hear not just the drip of distant water, but the echo of ambition, tucked into limestone bedsheets. So now, dear dreamer, let's climb softly up and out, one step at a time, toward daylight once again. Our next story? A utopia not underground, but somewhere even more difficult to reach. A floating dream. This one began not in a village or a forest or a wide plain, but in a port. France, mid-1800s. The age of idealists. You couldn't throw a pebble in a Parisian cafe without hitting someone who wanted to restructure all of society. Among them was a man named Jules Lechevalier, part economist, part utopian evangelist, and full-time dreamer with sea legs. His plan? Create a floating utopia. Not just a ship, but a society at sea. A mobile commune that would travel from port to port, spreading cooperation, education, and, of course, Fourierist philosophy. Yes, Fourier again, our old lemonade ocean friend. Lechevalier called it Aurora, French for dawn, because, naturally, every utopia begins at sunrise. The Aurora would be a self-contained phalanstery on the ocean, a vessel where passengers lived collectively, labored cooperatively, and governed themselves democratically, all while floating peacefully over the waves. I imagine it like this. Early morning mist curling off the sea, the creak of the hull, salt on your lips, the gentle hiss of sails unfurling overhead, and below deck, a tidy common room lined with maps, cookbooks, and volumes of Fourier's theories, none of which mention what to do in a storm. Cabins were shared. Meals eaten communally. Each passenger assigned duties: kitchen work, cleaning, sail maintenance, philosophy discussions at 4. There was no private wealth on the Aurora, only contribution. One might say it was the closest thing to a socialist cruise in human history. The plan, in theory, was elegant. The ship would trade goods, tools, produce, textiles, with coastal communities, while offering free education and cultural exchange. A kind of drifting embassy of utopia. But here's the rub. Ships require very practical knowledge. Navigation, repairs, weather forecasting. Not exactly strengths of most armchair philosophers. There are whispers that Lechevalier's group made it as far as constructing or purchasing a small vessel. Some sources claim they held meetings aboard her. Others suggest the full journey never materialized, that Aurora was more blueprint than brigantine. Either way, the project fizzled. It was simply too ambitious, too expensive, too damp. But the idea stayed afloat, for a while. Other seaborne commune concepts bobbed up over the years. A few in California, one in Japan, even a Cold War-era group in international waters that declared its own micronation on a decommissioned platform. None lasted. But oh, the poetry of it. A boat, a world, a shared purpose. Just you, your crew mates, and the sea stretching forever around you. I sometimes imagine lying in a hammock strung between masts, stars swirling overhead, the soft lapping of water below, a fiddle playing from the galley, someone reading aloud from Rousseau. And for one brief moment, it all makes sense. There's no need for nations or borders. No kings. No banks. Just wind, will, and togetherness. Then a wave slaps the hull, and someone spills the communal stew, and reality comes rushing back. But that's the charm of these floating dreams. Even if they never quite leave the dock, they give us permission to imagine another course. Now, let the ship drift further into the dark. Let the sails grow still. Let your own thoughts sail softly into slumber. We've reached the end of part 2, 5 more dreams behind us. The next chapter awaits in part 3. Fresh stories, strange communes, and even more forgotten hopes tucked between the folds of time. Chapter 3. The Hopedale community. Picture a small New England town in the 1840s. A neat little row of houses. A schoolhouse. A workshop humming softly with tools. Children carrying pails of water, their voices quiet. Not by force, but by choice. This was Hopedale, Massachusetts. A place where people came together not just to share meals or land, but to share values. Equality, simplicity, and gentle restraint. The Hopedale community was founded in 1841 by a Unitarian minister named Aidan Ballou. He was a soft-spoken man with strong beliefs, especially in Christian nonviolence and practical socialism. Not the fiery kind, the tender kind. Imagine if Mr. Rogers and Gandhi started a village together. That was Hopedale. Ballou believed society could be healed through cooperative living, pacifism, and shared labor. Everyone was welcome, men, women, children, so long as they embraced the community's rules. No weapons, no alcohol, no fighting, no boasting, no showing off your corn yield like you were the hotshot of the harvest. Even their punishments were gentle. If someone disrespected the peace, they got a firm talking to and a short suspension of dinner privileges. In Hopedale, spiritual development was just as important as farming or shoemaking. Everyone worked, regardless of gender. Women weren't confined to kitchens. Men weren't excused from diapers. Labor was honored in all forms. And every job mattered. One resident wrote, "There was no aristocracy of muscle or mind." Imagine that, a world where no one acted superior because they could quote Latin or split firewood in one swing. The community printed its own newspaper, hosted town meetings, and even established a kind of microbank to manage shared funds. They built modest homes, each painted a soft white, with shared wells and gardens. They held readings at night, sang hymns, sometimes, very carefully, played checkers. Hopedale was a place of quiet joy. Not euphoria, not ecstasy, just that contented feeling you get when the kitchen is clean, the lamp is lit, and someone you love is softly humming in the next room. But, as you might guess, quiet dreams are still vulnerable. Over time, differences emerged. Some members wanted to expand the community's commercial ventures. Others feared that growth would weaken their values. Ballou, ever the idealist, resisted the push toward profit. Eventually, one of the more business-minded members, a man named Eben Draper, gained influence. The community's factories began producing textiles for broader markets. Wages replaced cooperative labor. The ideals began to fray. By the 1850s, Hopedale had transformed from a spiritual commune into something more like a company town. Baloo remained in the village. He preached. He taught. But the dream he planted had changed shape. Still, the traces remained. Even today, if you visit Hopedale, you'll find those quiet streets. Those old white houses. A gentle echo in the trees. And in the local library, if you're lucky, you might find Baloo's handwritten sermons, full of gentleness and conviction, like lullabies with footnotes. He never gave up, you know. He believed the world could be better. Not louder, not faster, just kinder. So, as we leave that peaceful village behind, let your thoughts rest for a moment in stillness. You don't need to rush. The next chapter can wait. But when you're ready, we'll wander into a community with stranger rules, where food was rationed by moral purity and no one was allowed to wear red. You may have heard of them, the Shakers. Not for what they built, but for how they moved. Those famous trembling dances of worship, where their bodies swayed and quaked with spiritual fervor. But behind the rhythmic clapping and swishing skirts was one of the most meticulous, orderly, and oddly soothing utopias ever built on American soil. One of the largest of these Shaker communities was called Union Village. Tucked into the hills of Ohio in the early 1800s, Union Village wasn't loud. It wasn't radical in its language, but it was radical in its lifestyle. No marriage, no private property, no personal possessions. Celibacy wasn't just suggested. It was required. All men and women lived separately, even as they worked side by side, mending fences, baking bread, weaving linen, and crafting some of the finest furniture ever built in America. They believed in simplicity, in discipline, in silence, and yet they danced. I know, it sounds contradictory, but then again, what is a good utopia if not a contradiction wrapped in a hymn? Picture it. A cool morning, fog curling in the orchards. You rise before dawn, wash in a basin of cold water, dress in plain, handmade clothing, gray, blue, brown, but never red. Red was too bold, too showy, too prideful. You join your brothers or sisters in the meeting house, an airy, echoing space built with perfect proportions, and begin the day in song. Slow, wordless tones, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. It wasn't about performance. It was about shedding the self. After breakfast, oatmeal, always plain, no sugar, you take up your daily task. Some worked in the herb gardens, others in the broom shop. The Shakers were brilliant inventors. Did you know they created the circular saw, the flat broom, even early washing machines? All because they valued efficiency, simplicity, quiet elegance. At Union Village, every drawer slid perfectly. Every stair was level. Even the barns looked like they'd been dusted by angels. Children were adopted into the community, raised without competition, taught to read, sew, farm, and, of course, pray. Not out loud, but through work. The act of folding a shirt just right was a form of devotion. Meals were eaten in silence. Shoes were stored in labeled cubbies. And your bed? You could bounce a coin on it. There was comfort in that order. A rhythm. But order is fragile. As time passed, the Shaker numbers dwindled. Celibacy, it turns out, is not the best population strategy. And the modern world, noisy, chaotic, self-obsessed, began to pull people away. Young adults left to marry. Others grew weary of the quiet rules. By the late 1800s, Union Village was fading. Not crumbling, just softening, like fabric worn smooth by time. The buildings stood, white and wooden. The gardens still bloomed. But the songs were fewer. The dances slower. And today, the village is gone. Only a few structures remain, tucked into the folds of memory. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can imagine it. A long hallway, spotless and pale. The sound of broom bristles across a pine floor. A quiet song drifting up from a meeting room. A chair, handmade, so perfect it seems to hum beneath your fingertips. They weren't perfect, of course. No utopia ever is. But they believed in beauty, in harmony, in the radical act of quiet. So now, as the sun sets behind Union Village, let your thoughts settle like dust in a sunbeam. Let the silence speak. And soon, we'll journey to a much louder experiment. where families wore matching uniforms. And every meal came with a side of moral philosophy. There's a chilly breeze blowing off the Chenango River in upstate New York. And if you were there in the 1850s, you might have seen it. An enormous brick mansion rising from the snow-dusted fields like a theological boarding school crossed with an early hotel. That was Oneida. The Oneida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes in 1848, wasn't just a commune. It was a theological laboratory. A social experiment with rules so specific, they made Shaker life seem spontaneous by comparison. Let me paint the picture for you. You wake up in your neatly made bed, not your room, mind you, because private bedrooms were discouraged. Privacy was considered a form of selfishness. Instead, everyone slept in dormitory arrangements, separated by gender but rotated by age, purpose, and community need. Personal space? Not really a thing. Clothing was uniform. Meals were eaten in a shared hall with long tables and matching dishware. No loud conversation, no flirtation, and no dessert unless it was someone's birthday. Even then, only fruit. The community rejected traditional marriage. Instead, they practiced what they called complex marriage. Everyone was considered married to everyone. Romantic exclusivity was forbidden. Relationships were arranged by committee. Seriously, you had to apply to begin a romantic relationship, and if approved, the community matchmakers would assign you a partner. Imagine trying that on Tinder. Children were raised communally. Parents had little say after birth. Infants were cared for in a designated child wing, with trained caregivers who followed strict schedules and philosophies about early development. No indulgence, no favoritism. But here's the thing, it wasn't a prison. Many of the members liked it. They believed they were building heaven on earth. A purified society. One without jealousy, crime, or inequality. They farmed. They manufactured. They read philosophy by candlelight. They debated theology after dinner. And they were really good at making silverware. Yes, that Oneida. The spoons in your grandma's kitchen drawer? Quite possibly born of a community where personal property was banned and all affections had to be community sanctioned. The silverware funded the whole thing. It became their lifeline. While other communes crumbled under lack of resources, Oneida thrived economically, though emotionally. That was another story. Resentment built. Not everyone liked being told who to love or how. Noise, though charismatic, grew more controlling. Eventually, whispers turned to arguments. By the 1870s, outside pressure mounted. Noise fled to Canada. The remaining members voted to dissolve the communal lifestyle. By 1881, Oneida was no longer a utopia, just a business. The mansion still stands today. It's a museum now, red bricks still gleaming. Inside, you can see the long dining tables, the silent staircases, even some of the application forms for romantic pairings, carefully handwritten and signed. One reads, requesting spiritual union and companionship for 3 months, as permitted. Can you imagine? Love on lease. But that was Oneida, a place where emotion was regulated, where passion was filed under pending. And yet, people believed. They gave up freedom for the promise of purity, of unity, of harmony, not by instinct, but by design. So now, as we step out of that mansion and into the snow-dusted night, let your thoughts loosen. Let the rules fall away. Because our next dream? It takes us far away from committees, from application forms, and deep into the woods, where simplicity returned. And people tried to build Eden again, with pine trees, goats, and a library made entirely of good intentions. This one comes later than the others, still part of the same dream-filled century, but a little closer to the edge. A little less lace and hymn books, and a little more long hair and earth tones. We're in western Massachusetts now. The year? 1968. But don't worry, we're not breaking the rules. The roots of this place stretch all the way back to the spiritual communes of the 1840s. In fact, the people here thought they were finishing what those earlier dreamers began. It was called the Brotherhood of the Spirit, and later, the Renaissance Community. But the locals just called it the Commune in the Woods. It began with one young man, Michael Metellica, born Richard Green. He had a spiritual awakening while walking in the forest outside the small town of Warwick, Massachusetts. He felt a calling. He built a cabin. And then, people started showing up. At first just a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. No advertising, no flyers, just word of mouth. You'd meet someone at a rest stop or a farmer's market, and they'd say, "You should come see the Brotherhood." And off you'd go. They lived simply. Cabins, tents, yurts, even old-school buses. No electricity, no plumbing, just starlight, campfires, and a deep, slow kind of quiet. They farmed. They built their own structures. They meditated. They sang. And in the evenings, they gathered in a clearing beneath the trees to talk about love, energy, and what it meant to live right. It was equal parts Thoreau and Woodstock. No shoes were required. No money exchanged. One person's goat was everyone's goat. And if you had a skill, carpentry, cooking, flute playing, you shared it. There was a library, too. Of course there was. Full of hand-me-down paperbacks on metaphysics, gardening, nutrition, and ancient wisdom. A few novels. A lot of poetry. Even some old Shaker texts. They believed they were part of a spiritual evolution. That human beings were on the verge of a great awakening. And the Brotherhood would be the seed. I imagine walking through the woods in early fall. The leaves crunch beneath your feet. The air smells like wood smoke and apples. You pass someone making bread in a solar oven. Someone else is painting a mural on the side of a barn. No one's in a hurry. Time doesn't work the same here. But of course, life isn't just sunlight and herbal tea. As the years passed, the group changed. Grew more structured. Then too structured. Power concentrated. Personalities clashed. What began as shared simplicity evolved into something more like a spiritual cult. By the mid-1970s, the dream had fractured. Some left quietly, returning to the real world, with stories of goat yoga and eternal campfires. Others stayed, trying to keep the dream alive a little longer. Eventually, it all dissolved into memory. But if you walk those woods today, if you take the right trail and look closely enough, you might find the stones of a collapsed fire ring, a rusted garden tool half buried in moss, maybe even a little wooden sign faded by decades of rain that says, "Love is the key." And maybe it is. Maybe that's all the Utopians were ever trying to say. So now, dear traveler, take one last breath of that forest air. Let the trees close behind you. We have one more chapter left in part 3. One more flickering dream. And this time, it's about something we haven't touched yet. Joy. Yes, that was really its name. Modern Times. It sounds like a magazine or a hip cafe, doesn't it? But in 1851, nestled in the oak-lined wilds of Long Island, New York, Modern Times was a real place. A tiny village with big ideas and an even bigger distrust of pants with too many buttons. It was founded by Josiah Warren, a peaceful anarchist, if you can imagine such a thing. He wasn't into violent rebellion or toppling governments. He just wanted people to stop telling each other what to do. That was his whole deal. Warren believed every person should be entirely free to live their life, as long as they didn't interfere with others. He called it sovereignty of the individual. And so, Modern Times was born. No formal government, no police, no courts, and no jails. Just 90 or so residents, a printing press, and an unshakable belief in mutual respect. I picture the streets as quiet and sandy, lined with modest wooden homes. There's no town square, no mayor's office. Just a bakery, a carpenter's shed, and maybe a sign posted near a vegetable garden that says, "Do as you please, but don't be a jerk." Warren even had his own currency, called labor notes. If you worked 1 hour building a fence, you got a note worth 1 hour of someone else's time. Barter, but with receipts. He built a little store where everything was labeled not by price, but by how long it took to make. A hat might be 2.5 hours. A rocking chair? 5 hours, including sanding. It was, in a way, the first time in materials utopia. Modern Times had no churches, no town meetings, and absolutely no taxes. If you wanted to build a house, go ahead. If you wanted to start a singing circle or a woodworking class, go right ahead. Just don't force anyone else to join. And the amazing thing? It worked. For a little while. People built houses, grew food, printed newsletters full of poetry and personal manifestos. There were no bosses, no overseers, just neighbors figuring things out. One woman taught piano on her porch and accepted baked bread as payment. Another man sculpted birdhouses and told stories to anyone who stopped by. No one got rich, but no one went hungry either. And then came outsiders. The name Modern Times caught attention. Curious folks showed up, some with sincere interest, others looking for free land or for a place to cause trouble. The Civil War was looming. Slavery debates intensified. People brought their politics, their prejudices, their drama. Suddenly, the quiet dream felt crowded. By the 1860s, the community lost its thread. Some residents moved away. Others abandoned the labor note system. A few got into heated arguments about whether chickens had the right to free range onto neighboring porches. Eventually, the town was renamed Brentwood. In modern times, both the name and the experiment faded into history. But somewhere in those Long Island woods, among the blackberry bushes and the rustling sycamores, the laughter lingers. Sometimes I like to imagine sitting on one of those porches, watching the sunset. A cat curled at your feet. The neighbor's kid trying to balance on a barrel for fun. Someone strumming a banjo. No agenda. No meeting. Just being. Just joy. No sermons. No manifestos. Just a little village where people believed, even for a few years, that life could be simple, good, and shared. And maybe that's utopia enough. Now, take one last breath in that warm twilight air. We've reached the end of part 3. 15 dreams behind us. Some grand, some quiet, all vanished, but all still breathing, softly, in the folds of history. Chapter 4, Zion City, Illinois. Let me take you to a flat, windy stretch of northern Illinois, where the corn grows in tidy rows and the air smells of dust and dry ambition. The year is 1899, and on this land, a man named John Alexander Dowie, part preacher, part faith healer, part celestial entrepreneur, was building something extraordinary. Zion City, a place where sin would be banished, where medicine was outlawed, where the streets were named after biblical virtues like faith, obedience, and sanctification. A place where, Dowie promised, the people would walk not just toward heaven, but straight through the gates. He bought 6,500 acres of farmland and declared it sacred ground. Not metaphorically, legally. Zion was to be run not by politicians, but by the church. Specifically, his church. There would be no tobacco, no alcohol, no swearing, gambling, dancing, or doctors. Yes, medicine was banned. You didn't go to a clinic in Zion. You went to a prayer meeting. And if your leg was broken, well, you just had to believe harder. But let's rewind for a moment. Because on the surface, Zion looked peaceful. Picture this. Simple white homes, each with a small garden. Streets lined with trees, every block identical. A huge tabernacle in the center, its spires slicing into the sky like a giant exclamation mark made of shingles and steeple. Children played in matching uniforms, starched, collar-buttoned, and absolutely not running. That would be unseemly. Instead, they strolled. Orderly. Godly. Like very short deacons. Dowie himself wore long white robes and addressed crowds from a gilded pulpit, often comparing himself to Elijah. Not a prophet. The prophet. And the people believed him. Zion grew fast. More than 6,000 residents by 1905. There were factories, schools, publishing houses. They even had their own lace industry. Yes, really. Zion Lace became a regional brand. The town printed its own money, sold its own products, built its own theocracy. But Dowie grew bolder. He claimed miracles, predicted Christ's return, told people to reject worldly news and read only his own publication, The Leaves of Healing. He once ordered all pianos removed from homes because they distracted from prayer time. Then he tried to buy land in Mexico to expand the kingdom of Zion internationally. And finally, he declared himself the first apostle of the Christian Catholic Church in Zion, which sounded impressive until the lawsuits rolled in. Turns out, banning medicine wasn't just unpopular, it was legally dicey. And the money? The money started to vanish. By 1906, Dowie was ousted by his own board. His finances were audited, and Zion City, once glowing with banners of faith, quietly folded its celestial tent. But even after the prophet fell, the town remained. Zion still exists. You can drive through it today. The tabernacle is gone, but the street names remain. Hope Avenue, Glory Way, rows of quiet homes, soft-spoken descendants of dreams. And somewhere, I imagine, a child still rides their bike past a faded sign that once read, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." And in that wind, a whisper of utopia, just enough to make you pause. So now, let's walk gently out of Zion's gates and onward to another dream. one with a different prophet, a different city, and a few more feathers. Florida, the land of palms, sand, oranges, and in the 1890s, a group of people who believed the earth was hollow. Yes, hollow. And not only that, we were all living inside it. This peculiar belief was held by a religious group known as the Khorasan Unity, led by a charismatic man named Cyrus Teed, who renamed himself Koresh. It means shepherd in Hebrew, and, well, he certainly tried to shepherd a whole lot of folks straight into a dream world that bent gravity, reality, and time itself. Let me set the scene. The air is warm, sticky, but not uncomfortable. Just that soft Florida humidity, buzzing with insects and faintly citrus-scented. A river flows nearby, slow, tea-colored, reflecting the blue sky that, if the Khorasans were right, was actually the inside wall of the universe. They believed the stars weren't distant suns, but holes in the shell above us. And the sun? A revolving light fixture in the center of our domed reality. Strange? Yes, but beautifully sincere. In 1894, they settled in Estero, Florida, a small, scrubby patch of subtropical land just inland from the Gulf of Mexico. They brought books, violins, printing presses, and a celestial determination to build paradise. There were no marriages in the Khorasan Unity. Like the Shakers, they practiced celibacy, believing it preserved spiritual energy. Men and women lived separately but worked together. Every building, every brick, was laid with intention, and everything was beautiful. The community prized art, science, and order. They had a full orchestra, a theater troupe, a bakery that served sourdough bread and virtue in equal portions. They printed their own paper, the Flaming Sword, filled with theology, music theory, and the occasional call for donations. They wore flowing white robes for ceremonies, with golden sashes. Their gardens bloomed year-round. And if you stood quietly on a warm spring morning, you might hear four-part harmony drifting from the Unity Chapel, a blend of voices so soft, it could lull even the mosquitoes into stillness. Children were raised communally. Their hair was brushed with care, their books worn soft from gentle use. They studied astronomy, not to understand the stars, but to understand the curve of the world inside them. And Cyrus Teed, Koresh, was always nearby, guiding, teaching, sometimes just standing silently at the riverbank, watching the breeze ripple across the water like a thought he hadn't spoken yet. But even paradise isn't permanent. In 1908, Teed died suddenly. The community didn't bury him right away. They believed he would rise again. Literally, they waited in vigil. Hours, then days. Eventually, Florida's humidity had its say. The authorities intervened, and Koresh was laid to rest. His body, anyway, his dream, lingered. The unity began to fade. Slowly, gently, like a song that never really ends. It just trails off in a final hum. By the 1960s, only a handful of elderly Khorasans remained. Today, their village is preserved as a state historic site. You can walk the shaded paths, peek into their piano-filled performance hall, their book-lined libraries, their open-air kitchens. And if you close your eyes, you might still hear that soft melody, that gentle murmur of voices in the subtropical air, singing to the stars that were never quite what we thought. So now, let's float from Estero like pollen on a breeze. Next stop, a commune that took Utopia to the extreme. No money, no ownership, no parents, and no forks. We're traveling now far from the woods and rivers of America into another land. It's 1909, and we're standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Not a sea, really. A wide, glistening lake shimmering under the sun. The air smells of rosemary and warm stone. There are fish in the water, dates on the trees, and on the dusty ground, shovels, blankets, sacks of flour. This is where a small group of idealists, most of them young, many of them poets or revolutionaries, set down their bags and said, "This is where we will build it." Degania, the first kibbutz. The word means collective in Hebrew, but it also came to mean an experiment in human equality, an effort to live without class, without bosses, without greed, just sweat, sun, and cooperation. They slept in tents, at first, long rows of canvas flapping in the wind, held down by stakes and hope. There was no electricity, no plumbing, but there were books, always books, and goats. Can't forget the goats. You'd wake at dawn to the sound of bleeding and someone calling out the breakfast duties. Milk the cows, chop the onions, boil the lentils. And if it was your day for dishwashing, that was just as important as tractor repairs. In Degania, all work was holy, and no one earned more than anyone else. There was no private money, no property, no closed doors. Even clothing was shared. A sort of thrift shop rotation, where you'd pick out your shirt from a community bin and hope it didn't smell like onions. And the children? Ah yes, the children were raised together, not by their parents, but by the kibbutz. It was called the Children's House, a shared building with tiny beds, like a sleepy line of sardines, where the little ones lived communally. Parents visited daily, sure, but bedtime? That was the community's job. The idea was that no child would be spoiled. No one would be privileged. Everyone equal. From the very beginning. I imagine one of those nights. A lullaby echoing softly down the corridor. The cool wind brushing through the open window. A child turning in their sleep, not knowing which adult will be there in the morning, but knowing someone will be. And outside, the older members sit around a fire, eating olives and bread, discussing farming quotas and philosophy. One of them plays a flute. Another reads poetry in the dark. They believe they were doing something new, something better. A life without ownership, without competition. It worked for a while. The kibbutz movement spread across Israel. Dozens, then hundreds. Some big, some small, each with its own balance of idealism, struggle, and hummus. But over time, things changed. The world changed. The children began staying with their parents. The shared clothing bins faded. People wanted privacy. Paychecks, pensions. Degania adapted. It still exists today, but it's not quite the same. Now there are salaries, cars, apartments. Still cooperative, but more flexible. Yet if you walk the old paths, the ones between the date palms and the stone houses, you'll still feel it. That radical hope. The sense that everything could be shared. That you could raise a world, not just a child, with enough hands. So now, as the sun sets over the Galilee, let's let that hope linger for just a moment longer. And then drift onward. Because our next utopia? Well, it's made of glass. Let's begin with a dome. A glowing, golden sphere rising from the dust like a spaceship carved from sunlight. It sits at the heart of a strange, beautiful city where no one owns property, money is discouraged, and every citizen is a willing servitor of the divine consciousness. Welcome to Oroville. Not Iowa, not Indiana. This time, we're in southern India in the late 1960s. A new kind of dreamer's century is beginning. Oroville was founded by Mira Alfassa, known as the Mother, a French spiritual leader and collaborator of the Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo. She envisioned a city that belonged to no nation, no religion, and no one individual. A place where people of all cultures could live in harmony, beyond politics or possessions. It was approved by UNESCO, endorsed by the Indian government, laid out in perfect geometric harmony, like a mandala you could walk through. At its center, the Matrimandir, a massive golden sphere, part temple, part meditation hall. Inside, a single beam of sunlight strikes a crystal orb on a marble pedestal. No words, no rituals, just stillness. Outside, the city radiates in spirals, residential zones, green zones, creative zones. And in between, dreams. People came from everywhere. France, Argentina, Korea, Canada, Nigeria. They brought guitars, pottery wheels, water purification systems, books about biodynamic farming and silent meditation. They built their own homes, cooked in outdoor kitchens, and taught each other dozens of languages. There were no mayors, no banks, no police, only consensus, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Imagine trying to get 2,000 people from 40 countries to agree on how many tomatoes to plant. But they tried. Earnestly, lovingly. Committees were formed. Committees to review other committees. Permaculture classes bloomed like weeds. The children ran barefoot through forests. Some didn't wear shoes or much clothing until they were teenagers. There were no grades in the schools. No punishments. Just curiosity, kindness, and occasional chaos. Oroville wasn't perfect. It faced internal conflict, leadership issues, accusations of favoritism, even some land disputes. But it survived, because it wasn't about perfection. It was about the effort. Even now, Oroville exists. You can go, stay in a guest house, Attend a workshop on sacred geometry or composting with lunar cycles. Meditate in the Golden Dome. You won't find chain stores, or billboards, or traffic lights, but you might find a young woman building a solar panel with one hand and sculpting clay with the other, or a small group of people sitting in a circle under a banyan tree, deciding what to plant this season, lentils or lemon balm. And always, overhead, the soft hush of wind through neem leaves. Oroville reminds us that utopia doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it hums, quietly, persistently, like a warm breeze. So let that breeze carry us now, out of the Golden Dome and back to the dirt road. Because next, we visit a place where farming wasn't just encouraged, it was required. Where utopia meant uniformity, and the crops were counted by clipboard. We're back in the 1820s now. The edges of Tennessee. The land soft with wild grass and morning mist. Here, just outside Memphis, a woman named Frances Wright had a radical idea. She wanted to create a utopia, to end slavery, but not just by freeing people. She wanted to re-educate them, alongside white settlers, in a model community built on hard work, equality, and moral reform. This place was called Neshoba. It was part abolitionist colony, part socialist dream, and part very muddy farm. Frances Wright was Scottish, a writer, speaker, and freethinker who wore pants before it was even remotely acceptable. She spoke boldly about feminism, education, and racial justice. People called her the red harlot of infidelity. She smiled politely and kept going. She believed slavery was a curse, not just morally, but socially. Her solution? Buy enslaved people, free them, then educate and train them for a life of self-sufficiency before full emancipation. A complicated plan, yes, but rooted in good intentions. So she bought land in Tennessee, and thus Neshoba was born. Imagine the scene, a clearing in the woods, cabins built by hand, rows of corn and squash just starting to poke their heads above the soil. People of all backgrounds, black and white, men and women, free and formerly enslaved, working side by side. There was no luxury here, just wooden tools, one-room schoolhouses, dinners of beans and cornbread, and a bell that rang each morning at 6. The community was organized around work. Everyone had a job. Everyone contributed. If someone slacked off, well, they'd get a talking to during the weekly town circle. Frances Wright herself lived among them, shoveling manure, hauling lumber, sleeping on straw like everyone else. She taught literacy classes under lantern light, read Rousseau aloud between chores, helped write essays for a radical newspaper. But utopias, especially ones with that much mud, have their limits. First, there was the land. Swampy, infested with mosquitoes. The kind of place where your boots dissolve slowly into the ground. Then there were cultural frictions. Wright's ideals included racial equality and even open relationships. This did not go over well with neighboring settlers. Rumors swirled. Tensions rose. Donations dried up. And then came the fever. Malaria, probably. Maybe yellow fever. People got sick. Then sicker. Wright herself collapsed with illness and had to leave the colony for months. By the time she returned, Neshoba was falling apart. Supplies were low. Morale lower. Some members had left. Others questioned the rigid routines and the overwhelming isolation. And in 1830, just a few years after it began, Wright quietly arranged for the remaining formerly enslaved residents to be relocated to Haiti, where slavery had been abolished. And Neshoba was done, vanished back into the forest. But the echoes? They remain. Some say the forest there still feels different, as if something once mattered very deeply on that patch of ground. A few beams of the schoolhouse still lie under the soil. Sometimes, during the right sunset, locals say the grass looks like gold. And if you stand very still, you might hear the faint rhythm of a hoe striking the earth, or the rustle of a paper being read aloud, an essay on freedom. A voice clear, accented, and full of wild hope. Frances Wright didn't erase slavery, but she dared to imagine a world where freedom was more than a word. And for a few muddy years, she tried to build it. Now, as the fireflies rise over that Tennessee field, let your thoughts drift softly again. 5 more dreams behind us. We've reached the end of part 4. Up next, 5 new chapters, 5 more dreamers, and stories even stranger than before. Chapter 5. The Painted Dream of Bishop's Castle. Let me tell you a bedtime story about a man, a vision, and a castle in the sand. New Mexico, the 1880s. A vast desert stretching in all directions. Prickly pear, sagebrush, and the bones of buffalo long gone. And in the middle of it all, glinting in the heat haze like a mirage, stood a castle. Or rather, the beginning of one. It was being built by a man named Franklin Bishop, who had heard the voice of God. He wasn't a king, not even a preacher, technically, but he believed he had been chosen to build the New Jerusalem. Not metaphorically, literally. And so, brick by brick, he began. At first, people thought it was a church, then a home, then a monument to stubbornness. It was none of those, and all of them. Bishop declared the castle would be a sanctuary, a spiritual city, a place for the faithful to retreat from the sins of the world and live in peace, surrounded by beauty, color, and divine architecture. He called it the holy retreat of the recovered earth. Others called it Bishop's Castle. Some just called it that weird place with the towers. The structure itself was evolving. A bit of Gothic, a bit of Moorish, a splash of folk art meets biblical revivalist. Stained glass scavenged from broken windows. Walls painted in swirling colors. Sunflowers, sacred symbols, spirals. And no blueprint. Only visions. Imagine walking through it at sunset. The wind blowing through arches not yet enclosed. The scent of adobe and candle wax lingering in the stone. And somewhere, a voice reciting psalms from memory. Bishop welcomed anyone who wanted to join him. But they had to live by the rules. No alcohol. No swearing. Daily prayer. Weekly fasts. And you had to help build. He wasn't running a hotel. He was running a destiny. At its peak, there were about 30 people living on the grounds, sleeping in carved-out nooks, hand-spun tents, and hammocks strung from half-finished beams. They shared meals of beans, corn cakes, and sometimes cactus fruit. And every evening, they gathered to hear Bishop speak. He believed Christ would return to the castle, through the East Tower, at dawn, on a day no one could predict. And so they waited, and waited, and waited. One man worked on the bell tower for 6 years straight. Another painted birds on every door, 100 in total. No two alike. Children played among the scaffolding. A woman once gave birth in the crypt, then used it for quiet meditation. But as the years passed, the castle never quite finished. Supplies ran low. Interest faded. Bishop grew older. His visions less frequent. The desert winds returned, whispering through open windows, as if asking when it would all be done. And then, one day, Bishop simply stopped building. He sat in the main hall, lit a candle, and said, "The Lord has chosen silence." No one knew what he meant, and by the time they figured it out, he was gone. The community drifted apart. Some went home. Some stayed nearby. Others moved to communes in Arizona or Colorado, bringing with them stories of the castle that never ended. Today, the shell of Bishop's Castle still stands. Cracked, weathered, covered in graffiti and vines. But still beautiful, still humming. Sometimes hikers find it by accident. They walk through its halls and wonder. Feel the dust between the tiles. Read faded Bible verses carved into wood. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, they hear it. A hammer. A prayer. A footstep in an empty tower. A dream that didn't disappear. It just never finished. So now, let's step gently away from the sand. Let the stars wheel overhead. And move toward another vision. This one colder. Stricter. A dream forged in ice. Iowa. Just the name sounds quiet, doesn't it? Endless rows of corn. The wind threading gently through the fields. Barns creaking. A screen door tapping against its frame. But in the 1850s, tucked away in those gentle hills, was a small group of people building a very specific kind of heaven on earth. The inspirationists, they called themselves. Their utopia? A manna, not to be confused with the appliance brand. Although yes, eventually, it did make washing machines. But before it sold dishwashers, it sold something stranger, silence, obedience, an incredibly well-made sauerkraut. Let me explain. The Amana colonies were founded by a group of German pietists, people who believed the world was too loud, too sinful, and too full of ambition. They didn't want cities or sermons. They wanted stillness. And so, after escaping persecution in Europe, they came to America and purchased 26,000 acres in Iowa. 7 villages in all, arranged just so. Each with nearly identical buildings, almost no personal decorations, and daily life ordered down to the minute. Imagine waking in a gray stone house. The bed stiff, the window curtain white, the air cold. You dress in plain wool clothing. Not because it's trendy, because it's humble. At 6 a.m., the bell rings. At 6:05, you eat. At 6:25, you pray. At 6:45, you're working. Jobs rotated, but always under supervision. Women baked, wove, sewed. Men farmed, tanned hides, built furniture. Each day, you returned home not to relax, but to study scripture. No dancing, no jewelry, no photographs, and no unnecessary laughter. Seriously, that was in the rules. It wasn't harsh, just calm. So calm that even the roosters were probably embarrassed to crow. Meals were served communally. No menus. No second helpings unless everyone agreed. Conversations were allowed, but light and orderly. You didn't own your clothes, or your tools, or your house. Everything belonged to God, or at least to the village. And yet, there was kindness here, a strange gentleness in the monotony. No one went hungry. No one was homeless. Children were raised together, taught literacy and ethics before arithmetic. Elders were respected. Labor was valued equally. A man who churned butter was no less respected than a man who read Hebrew. One resident once wrote, "I do not feel joy. I do not feel sorrow. I feel peace." And maybe that was the goal. For 80 years, the Amana colonies thrived. Then came the slow unraveling. Younger members wanted change. Privacy. Independence. A little jazz, maybe. The Great Depression squeezed their finances. The world was shifting fast. And so, in 1932, the communal system was voted out. Amana reorganized into a corporation. Wages were introduced. Property returned to individuals. The people remained, but the dream was folded neatly, like a prayer shawl placed back in a drawer. But it never truly disappeared. Today, Amana still exists. A tourist destination now, with German bakeries, hand-woven linens, and guided tours of what once was. You can walk those tidy streets, eat in the old communal kitchens, touch the stone walls, and if you sit quietly near one of the original homes, maybe beneath a maple tree just starting to turn, you might feel it. Not joy, not sorrow, just stillness. And sometimes, stillness is enough. Now, let's take one last quiet breath in this village of shadows and wool. The air is cooling. The dream is folded. And next, we travel to a place far less disciplined. A commune that ran on the power of play. The name alone feels like something from a storybook, doesn't it? Freeville. And for a short, flickering moment in the 19th century, that's exactly what it was. Let me take you there. New York State, somewhere between the sleepy green hills and lazy riverbanks. It's the 1870s. The Civil War is over, but its wounds are still fresh. America is reeling, rebuilding, and reimagining. And in a forgotten corner of it all, a few eccentric teachers, idealists, and orphans came together to build something completely different. They called it Freeville, or sometimes, the Children's Republic. And here was the idea: what if kids ran the town? Not just played town, but built it, managed it, lived it. This little village wasn't just for children, it was by children. Designed to be a miniature democracy, where kids could elect their own mayor, publish their own newspaper, settle disputes in their own court, and, mostly, eat too many apples. At first glance, it looked like a summer camp. But it wasn't. There were buildings, tiny post offices, a general store with make-believe prices, and a town hall where 12-year-olds debated taxes and argued about chickens. Yes, chickens. Freeville had exactly 7 of them, all named after founding fathers. The oldest residents were 15. The youngest? 5. All equal citizens. Some had come from orphanages. Others were sent by parents looking for something gentler. And a few? Well, they just wandered in. Each morning, the town bell rang. A squeaky brass handbell attached to a stick. The citizens gathered, voted, read articles from the Freeville Gazette, written mostly in crayon. Then off they went to their jobs. Some baked bread. Some cared for the goats. Some just painted signs like, "Do not feed the clouds," or "This is a tree. Do not arrest it." Play was sacred, but so was respect. If you broke something, you fixed it. If you hurt someone's feelings, you wrote them a poem. There were a lot of poems. Some were just the word sorry in different colors. The town had its own jail. Not a real one, of course. Just a small hut where offenders sat quietly for 10 minutes and had to listen to someone read Emerson out loud. But the laws were real, passed by vote, enforced by kids in handmade uniforms with badges that said, "Please be nice." And for a time, it worked. Freeville thrived. Visitors came from far away to marvel at this little republic of small hands and big hearts. Newspapers wrote about it. Educators studied it. And then, as these stories often go, the adults got involved. The founders disagreed on how much freedom to allow. Some thought the town should expand, bring in more structure, more oversight. Others wanted to let it stay wild, wobbly, and full of chalk drawings. Donors argued. Philosophers debated. And the kids? They just wanted to plant marigolds and make forts out of hay bales. Eventually, funding dried up. The property was sold. The republic dissolved. The children packed up their signs. The goats were rehomed. The bell, according to legend, was tossed into a lake. But some say, if you stand at that lake on a warm afternoon, just as the sun begins to tip toward the treetops, you can hear it. The faint clang of a bell. A burst of laughter. A child's voice saying, "Let's vote on it." And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel the soft tug of something precious. The idea that we're never too small to dream something big. That even tiny hands can build a world. Now let's step gently away from the sandbox. Because our next utopia? It was built not on laughter, but law. And in this place, no one smiled unless it was scheduled. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ford, as in cars? Yes, exactly. This isn't a story from New England or the dry hills of the West. This is deep in the Amazon rainforest. Hot, damp, swarming with mosquitoes and vines that grow fast enough to pull your boots off. And here, in 1928, America's most famous industrialist, Henry Ford, decided to build a perfect town. Not in Detroit, but in Brazil. He called it Fordlandia. Let me paint the picture. You're floating up the Tapajos River. Its waters dark and thick like oversteeped tea. Parrots call overhead. The sun presses down like a heavy hand. And then, suddenly, around a bend, there it is. A whitewashed town. Straight roads. Neatly spaced houses. A school. A hospital. A central square with a flagpole and a clock that's always on time. And music. Marching band music. Fordlandia wasn't meant to be a spiritual utopia. It was meant to be a rubber plantation. Henry Ford needed rubber for his car tires. And rather than depend on European-controlled markets, he thought, I'll grow my own. But this is where it gets sleepy and strange. Because Ford didn't just want rubber. He wanted to transplant his entire worldview, Midwestern morality, American efficiency, and small-town values, into the heart of the Amazon. So he built a city. With rules. Strict ones. Residents were required to eat in cafeterias at assigned tables. No alcohol was allowed, ever. There were curfews. Uniforms. Mandatory square dancing on Fridays. Steak dinners were served. Jazz was frowned upon. And workers, mostly Brazilians, were expected to conform to an entirely foreign rhythm. Fordlandia had a golf course, but no golf balls. It had Model T Fords, but no roads beyond town. Imagine it. A worker in canvas slacks and a straw hat, holding a tray of canned peaches, listening to a Victrola playing Sousa marches, while the jungle hums outside like it's laughing under its breath. And the rubber trees? They didn't grow. At least, not well. Ford insisted on planting them in neat rows, like corn. But rubber trees don't like neat rows. They're vulnerable that way. The bugs knew it. So did the fungus. The plantations failed. The workers grew frustrated. There were riots over cafeteria menus. Some say it was the rice pudding that finally pushed things too far. Eventually, Ford gave up. He abandoned the dream. Left behind buildings, chairs, forks, even unopened crates of powdered milk. And the rainforest took it back. Today, Fordlandia is a ghost town. You can still walk its streets. See the faded paint. The skeletal factory. Rain drips through the windows now. Moss crawls up the clock tower. And inside one of the abandoned houses, a copy of the Ford Times still rests on a table, open to an article titled, How to Build a Happy Community. Maybe that was the problem. You can't engineer joy. You can't manufacture belonging. And the rainforest? It never read the instruction manual. Now let's step back from that silent town. Let the jungle swallow the path behind us. Because up next, we visit a utopia with no founder, no prophet, no philosopher, just a dinner table, and 1,000 bowls of soup. The place was Aurora, Oregon. The year? 1856. And the dream? To live without want. without war, without ownership, and above all, without hunger. They were known as the Aurora Colony, and they weren't flashy about it. No temples, no declarations, just a town of modest cabins, warm bread, shared songs, and the ever-present sound of soup being stirred. Founded by a man named Wilhelm Kiel, a Prussian immigrant with a beard like Moses and a voice like a warn hymn, the community began as a kind of religious commune, but not a strict one. No brimstone, no robes, just a quiet belief in the power of shared life. Kiel called it a practical Christianity. You didn't need to preach love. You needed to practice it. So that's what they did. They built homes side by side, tilled long rows of cabbage and carrots, sang lullabies in German and English, and every single night, they gathered for dinner. It wasn't fancy, not curated. No one Instagrammed their plates. But it was sacred. Everyone brought something. A loaf of rye, a bowl of beans, a story, a spoon. The table stretched through the main hall, just long enough that everyone had a seat, but short enough that you could hear your neighbor's voice without leaning. If someone was sick, a child would bring them their food. If someone was sad, a fiddle would play a song just for them. The rules were simple: no private property, no punishment without forgiveness. No one eats until everyone is fed. The town ran on consensus. Every week, they met. Not in pews, not in courts, but on benches, around a fire, with bread in hand. They made their own clothes, pressed cider in the fall, held dances that started with prayer and ended with stomping feet. Kiel led them, but not as a king. More like a conductor. He nudged the rhythm, kept the tone. When his son Willie died on the journey west, Kiel had his body preserved in alcohol inside a lead-lined coffin. He placed it on the wagon, and for the rest of the journey, they sang to him every night. That's the kind of community it was. Even grief was shared. Aurora thrived for nearly 2 decades. Their harvests were strong, their hearts fuller. But Kiel died in 1877, and as with many of these stories, the dream began to waver. Leadership fractured. Newcomers wanted wages. The communal model softened, then dissolved. By the 1880s, Aurora was just another town. But the dinner table? It stayed. For years, families kept meeting, even as the commune faded. Even as the land was parceled and the schoolhouse became a post office. They still brought bread, still passed the beans, still told stories. And even now, you can visit Aurora. There's a museum, some restored homes, a bakery that sells sourdough made from the colony's original starter. If you listen closely near the old meeting hall, you might hear it. The clink of spoons, the laughter between bites, a lullaby hummed in the steam of a lentil stew. No sermons, no stages, just a place where people fed each other. And maybe that's the simplest utopia of all. Now rest, friend. Part 5 is complete. 25 dreams behind us. And in Part 6, the final stretch, we visit the last 5. The strangest, the softest, the ones that whisper instead of speak. Chapter 6, The Quiet Retreat of Skywater. Let me take you now, not to a specific dot on the map, but to a place more like a breath. They called it Skywater. Founded in 1881, in the hills of what is now Northern California, somewhere between the edge of the redwoods and the folds of the clouds. There were no roads to Skywater, just footpaths, worn smooth by bare soles. Because shoes, you see, were discouraged. Not banned, just not encouraged. Let the earth touch you, the founders said. You've been too far from it. The community began with only a handful of people. Artists, gardeners, widows, dreamers. They came not because they wanted to change the world, but because the world had become too loud. Skywater had no leader, no formal beliefs, just one principle, written on the wall of the first cabin: be kind, then be quiet. There were no clocks, no alarms. People woke with the sun and slept when the stars began to sing. Homes were made of clay and stone, tucked into hillsides like mushrooms. They blended into the trees. No sharp corners, no paint, and no mirrors. Why? Because Skywater believed you shouldn't see yourself more than you saw the sky. Food was grown, of course, mostly root vegetables, fruit, wild herbs. Meals were communal, but silent. Instead of conversation, people hummed. Sometimes little melodies, sometimes just breath. Each day began with a walk, alone or in pairs. Not for exercise, not for achievement, just to feel the wind. And once a week, everyone gathered in the largest grove, beneath a crooked pine that locals called the Listener. There were no sermons, no announcements. They just sat, in stillness, together. And when someone had something to share, a poem, a memory, a sorrow, they would whisper it into the tree's bark and walk away. Skywater's only industry was its letters of silence. Handmade pages of blank paper, wrapped in soft cloth, mailed to people who requested them. A reminder to pause, to hush, to sit with nothing but their own heartbeat. They became oddly popular. For a time, Skywater was flooded with requests from cities and towns all over the country. Thousands of envelopes came in. Most were opened. Some were never even read. Just the act of receiving a quiet letter was enough. But time has its own rhythm. Skywater faded slowly, as all soft things do. By 1905, the last cabin was empty. The footpaths began to fade beneath the underbrush. Only the Listener remained. They say the tree still leans, still hums in the wind. And if you press your ear to its bark on a quiet morning, you might hear a secret, a lullaby, a poem about clouds, or nothing at all. And somehow that's enough. So now, let's walk gently down from the hill. Let the hush wrap around your shoulders like a shawl. Because our next utopia, it lived in firelight, and left behind something warm, even as it turned to ash. The word itself means hope, and that's exactly what they tried to build. The year was 1872. The place, somewhere along the Rio Grande, nestled in the borderlands of Texas. A quiet place, dry air, brush and mesquite. A land where the stars burn close and the ground remembers footsteps for days. They called their home Esperanza, but not because they were chasing heaven. No, they were running from something. From war, from judgment, from the weight of a world too heavy to carry anymore. Esperanza was founded by a group of Civil War deserters, former soldiers, mystics, and wandering widows. They had no clear doctrine, only a handful of shared promises spoken aloud over a campfire. No weapons, no punishment, no ownership, and once a week, a night of fire and dance. That was Esperanza. No churches, no flags, just a loose ring of adobe huts, a large communal hearth, and a circle drawn in the dust where every Thursday they celebrated being alive. During the day, they worked quietly, farming, fixing things, gathering mesquite pods and chili peppers. Children tended goats. Old men repaired sandals. Someone always sang while they stirred beans in the pot. But at night? Oh, the nights. The central fire would be lit at sundown. Low drums would begin to pulse. And every resident, whether 8 or 80, would come, barefoot, to the circle. No choreography, no performance, just movement. A swaying of bodies, a lifting of arms, a slow, hypnotic celebration of having made it one more week. They didn't speak much during the dances, didn't clap, didn't cheer. They just moved, together, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours. They said the fire told them when it was over. One visitor, a passing merchant, wrote that he saw more joy in one night at Esperanza than in all the city balls of Boston. There were no leaders. Decisions were made by consensus. Children were raised collectively. Meals were shared. There was no punishment, only time. If you did harm, you were simply asked to sit out the dance. That was considered punishment enough. And it worked. Not perfectly, but beautifully. For almost 20 years, Esperanza lived. And then, slowly, the world caught up. Land ownership, taxes, railroads. The border shifted. A dispute with local authorities over who actually owned the land led to pressure, threats, eventual dispersal. The residents scattered, some to Mexico, some further north. A few stayed behind, quiet elders who refused to leave. By 1901, the fire was out. But even now, you can find the circle. The hearth is long gone. The huts collapsed. But the ring in the earth remains, barely visible, like a fingerprint left in dust. They say that if you stand in that circle on a Thursday evening and you close your eyes, you might feel your feet begin to sway, your breath deepen, and a warmth rise up from the ground, as if a fire still burns there. Esperanza didn't try to change the world. It just tried to remind people that being was enough. So now, let's turn away from the glow. Let the fire dim behind us, and walk toward the water. Because our next utopia? It floated. It was never really meant to be called that. Not officially. But the people who lived there whispered the name, Lake Eden. A name for something temporary. Something quiet. Something made not with bricks or rules, but with wood, art, and the deep patience of people who had nothing to prove. We're in North Carolina now. The year? 1937. The air smells of pine needles and lake water. Cicadas sing their high, steady lullaby. And on the shore of a small lake surrounded by rolling forest, a community is building something that doesn't look like a commune. It looks like a retreat, but not for leisure, for living. This was the tail end of the Great Depression. The world was exhausted. And in these woods, a group of musicians, writers, dancers, and farmers quietly stepped away from the noise and built a raft of beauty. They called it Black Mountain College. An experimental school, yes, but also a kind of utopia. Here, students helped build their own classrooms. Professors worked the gardens. Everyone cooked. Everyone cleaned. And no one stood too far above anyone else. There were no grades. No strict hierarchy. The president of the college often washed dishes alongside first-year students. But what made Black Mountain, what made Lake Eden, different was the space it offered. Time, stillness, possibility. Classes were held outdoors. Philosophy beneath trees. Poetry on docks. Dance, always by the lake. And every afternoon, when the work was done, silence. No mandatory anything. Just an invitation, go. Create something. Or don't. One student built a floating studio, half canoe, half easel, where she painted watercolors that melted into each other like fog. Another strung lines between pine trees and composed music based on the sounds of acorns falling. Buckminster Fuller taught here. So did Merce Cunningham. And John Cage. But this wasn't a school. Not really. It was a whisper. A pause in time. A belief that a few people, living simply and making honestly, could float above the noise and maybe even glimpse the future. There were no fences, no uniforms, no dorm inspections. If you were tired, you could sleep under a tree. If you were angry, you could walk around the lake twice. If you were in love, you could carve their name in the canoe and no one would stop you. And for a while, it worked. Black Mountain College wasn't rich, but it was full of music, of laughter, of long, aimless conversations on porches about truth, bread, and what color sadness really is. Then came time. Funding grew scarce. Students moved on. The lake remained. By 1957, the college closed. But Lake Eden? It never left. Today, the land is a retreat again, host to festivals, artists, thinkers. The cabins have been repaired. The trees are taller, but the spirit remains. And on quiet mornings, when the fog rolls over the water and the loons begin to sing, you can almost hear it. Not a lecture, not a sermon, but a whisper. Be here. Make something. Float. Now, let's step off the dock. Let our feet touch the ground again. Because next, we'll walk through a place that wasn't shaped by water, but by color. Nobody really remembers the town's original name. It was something like Cotton Ridge or Elmford, one of those dusty little blips on a map that got passed over when the railroad went elsewhere. But then, sometime around 1893, a woman named Rebecca Howell arrived, and everything began to shimmer. Rebecca was a widow, 42 years old, with no children, little money, and, by her own account, entirely too many ideas. She stepped off a wagon with a trunk full of books, 2 crates of paint, and a note pinned to her shawl that said, "I will make this town beautiful, whether it likes it or not." And that's what she did, one building at a time, one brushstroke at a time. The bakery? She painted the front with vines and birds so lifelike, passers-by tried to feed them crumbs. The post office? Covered in sunbursts, stars, and quotes from poets no one had read in years. The well in the center of town? She wrapped it in scenes of oceans, despite no one in the town having ever seen one. And when someone asked why, she said, "Because beauty is contagious, and I'm starting an epidemic." At first, people laughed. Then they helped. One man carved little faces into the wooden fence rails. A teenager painted her bicycle mint green and named it Optimism. Children began tying ribbons to trees just to see what it felt like. And the town changed. Not just the colors. The rhythm. People walked slower, talked softer, started saying things like, "Doesn't the sky look lavender today?" instead of "hot enough for you." Rebecca never charged a cent. She refused gifts. She only asked one thing of anyone who moved into town. Paint something. A rock. A door. Your boots. Didn't matter. Just participate in the dream. And it worked. For a while. The town became known in surrounding areas as Rebecca's Gate, a nickname born from the floral archway she built at the edge of town, covered in painted wildflowers that changed with the seasons. Tourists began arriving. Artists, poets, wandering types with smudged glasses and sketchbooks full of dreams. For a few golden years, Rebecca's Gate was alive with color, music, and kindness. But Rebecca? She quietly stepped back. She painted less, sat more, listened to the laughter with a small, satisfied smile. She passed away one spring morning. No big announcement, just a note left on her front door in her unmistakable handwriting. It is enough. Keep painting. And they did, for a while. But time moves on. Storms weather paint. People move. Newer buildings went up, gray ones. Less lace, more linoleum. But Rebecca's Gate still exists. If you know where to look. Somewhere off a forgotten highway, tucked behind tall pines and taller stories. And if you walk its streets at golden hour, you'll find color. Maybe not everywhere, but enough. A blue door with yellow swirls. A mailbox shaped like a whale. A child's mural on the side of an old barn, faded but smiling. And somewhere, in a garden overgrown with lavender and mint, a rock, painted pink, with the words, "Begin again." So now, let's leave Rebecca's Gate behind. Only one chapter remains. One final dream. A place that never truly existed and yet lives in every one of these stories. They never named it. There were no signs, no town charter, no articles of incorporation. Just a clearing in the woods. Maybe it was Vermont. Maybe Oregon. Maybe it only existed between thoughts. But those who found it never forgot it. It began with 3 people. One brought seeds. One brought a violin. One brought a kettle and said, "We'll need tea." That's all. No plans. No rules. No manifesto nailed to a tree. They cleared a small circle and made a fire. Not to cook. Not to signal. Just to gather around. They didn't speak much. There were no introductions. No names. They simply shared what they had. A story. A blanket. A plum. Then others came. Not because they were invited, but because sometimes we're drawn to stillness like moss to stone. One woman brought thread. She mended whatever was torn. Another brought an old chair and set it beneath a tree for anyone tired. A boy brought nothing. They gave him a sandwich and a stick, and he carved birds into the trunks. There were no buildings, no plots of land, just hammocks, soft voices, and an understanding that whatever you needed was already here. If someone was angry, they walked. If someone was weeping, they were held. If someone sang off key, well, that became the melody for the day. At night, they sat around the fire and listened, not to lectures, not to declarations, just to wind, to each other, to the silence between stars. No one asked, "What is this place?" Because they already knew. It was what happened when people stopped trying to fix the world and started listening to it. They called it nothing, and that was enough. Some stayed a night, some a year. Some came back decades later, older, quieter, and still carrying that warmth tucked somewhere behind their ribs. And one day it was gone. The clearing, the fire ring, the chair under the tree, all covered now in wild grass and memory. But if you close your eyes, right now, and listen closely, you'll hear it. The kettle, the soft crunch of someone arriving, the sigh of a hammock welcoming your weight. And maybe you'll realize something. This last utopia, it's not in the past. It's not in the woods. It's right here, in your stillness, in your breath, in the space between this word and the next. And now, dear traveler, may these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. Let the stories fade gently into your breath. Let your thoughts scatter like the soft hush of leaves. There's nothing left to do, no work to finish, no lines to memorize. Just sleep. And if this journey helped you rest, if it soothed your mind and softened your evening, tap like. Maybe subscribe, only if it feels right. And if you drifted off somewhere back in Fruitlands or Fordlandia, let me know below. I'll hold your place. Sweet dreams. This has been Boring History for Sleep. Shoo, good night.